Before Uncle Tom's Cabin shocked the world and helped ignite the fire against slavery, there was a real man whose life was far more brutal, courageous, and extraordinary than fiction ever revealed. His name was Josiah Henson, a man born into bondage in Tennessee, sold, beaten, broken, and yet never destroyed. While millions read Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel believing Uncle Tom was only a character, few ever learned that the heart of that story was drawn from the flesh and blood suffering of a real enslaved man whose voice history quietly buried. Josiah Henson's childhood was marked by violence so severe it would scar him for life. His father beaten nearly to death, his family torn apart on the auction block, and his own body branded by slavery before he was even a teenager. Yet within that cruelty grew a rare strength. He learned to read, to lead, to endure, and eventually to escape, transforming himself from an enslaved laborer into an abolitionist, minister, and international symbol of freedom. Queens, presidents, and reformers would one day listen to him speak, but his name would still fade behind a fictional shadow. This is the untold story of the Tennessee slave Josiah Henson, the real man behind Uncle Tom's Cabin. A story of faith tested by chains, loyalty betrayed by masters, and a life that helped change how the world saw slavery, even as the man himself was almost erased from memory. Josiah Henson was born into slavery in the late 18th century in the rolling countryside of what would later become the state of Tennessee, a place where bondage was not just a system but the air enslaved people were forced to breathe from the moment they entered the world. He did not arrive into life with a surname, a birth certificate, or any claim to himself. From his very first breath he was legally defined as property, his existence measured not in years or dreams but in labor and monetary value. His mother, already enslaved, could offer him only love and protection within the narrow boundaries allowed by a system designed to strip both away. His father, too, lived under the constant threat of violence, knowing that any act of resistance, spoken or silent, could lead to brutal punishment or death. From his earliest memories, Josiah's world was shaped by fear and uncertainty. Enslaved families were not considered families in the eyes of the law. They were temporary groupings, allowed to exist only as long as it suited the economic interests of slaveholders. Children learned early that affection was dangerous because it could be taken away without warning. Mothers whispered prayers at night, not for comfort but for survival, hoping their children would not be sold before morning. Josiah grew up watching adults flinch at footsteps, lower their voices when white men approached, and hide their grief behind forced obedience. The plantation where Josiah was born operated like countless others across the South, sustained by unpaid labor and cruelty normalized through routine. Enslaved children were not spared simply because of their age. As soon as Josiah could walk steadily, he was expected to work carrying water, running errands, watching younger children, learning the rhythms of forced labor that would define his life. There was no childhood as the world understands it, only preparation for endurance. Hunger was common, rest was rare, and punishment was constant, often delivered not just to correct behavior but to remind enslaved people of their place. One of the defining traumas of Josiah's early life was the violent separation of his family, a wound that never truly healed. His father was subjected to horrific punishment for daring to resist abuse, beaten so severely that the scars became a permanent mark of what defiance cost in a slave society. Eventually his father was sold away, removed from the family forever, not because he committed a crime but because his existence threatened the authority of his enslaver. Josiah was still a child when this happened, old enough to understand the loss but powerless to stop. That moment taught him a lesson that slavery enforced relentlessly. Love offered no protection. His mother tried desperately to hold what remained of the family together, but her power was limited by a system that valued profit over humanity. Each day carried the fear that Josiah himself could be sold, sent to another plantation, another state, another life where no one knew his name or history. Enslaved children learned not to ask about tomorrow because tomorrow could belong to someone else. Josiah absorbed this reality quietly, developing an inner strength born from constant instability. As he grew older, Josiah became increasingly aware of the invisible lines drawn by race and status. He saw white children his age receiving education, care, and opportunity, while he was denied even the right to learn to read. Laws forbade the education of enslaved people not because learning was dangerous in itself, but because knowledge threatened control. Despite this, Josiah listened carefully to conversations around him, memorized words, and observed the world with a sharp intelligence that slavery could not extinguish. His mind became a place of resistance long before his body could. Being separated from family at such a young age forced Josiah to mature quickly. He learned how to navigate different masters, each with their own rules, tempers, and expectations. Survival required adaptability, silence when necessary, and endurance when silence failed. He learned how to read human behavior as carefully as he later learned to read words, understanding when to speak, when to submit, and when to hold on to his dignity internally even as it was denied outward. The trauma of separation did not make Josiah bitter in his youth, but it made him observant. He noticed how enslaved people created their own forms of family after being torn apart, calling elders auntie and uncle, forming bonds not through blood but through shared suffering. These relationships became lifelines, offering guidance, protection, and a sense of belonging in a world determined to erase both. Josiah was shaped by these communal bonds, learning early that survival under slavery was rarely an individual act but a collective one. Tennessee, where he was born, sat at a crossroads of cultures and economies, but for enslaved people geography offered little relief. Whether on tobacco fields, corn farms, or household labor, the rules of bondage remained the same. Josiah experienced the instability of being moved from place to place, each relocation reinforcing the reality that he had no control over his own body or future. Every transfer stripped away what little familiarity he had managed to build, forcing him to start again, to adapt again, to endure again. Yet even as a child, Josiah carried within him a quiet sense of self that slavery could not fully erase. He remembered his parents, their teachings, their resilience, and their faith. These memories became anchors, grounding him when everything else was taken. The separation that was meant to weaken him instead planted the seeds of endurance, shaping a boy who learned to survive not by surrendering his humanity, but by guarding it fiercely within. This beginning, being born enslaved, torn from family, and raised in an environment of sanctioned cruelty, was not just the opening chapter of Josiah Henson's life. It was the foundation upon which his later strength, leadership, and resistance were built, formed in a world that tried relentlessly to convince him that he was less than human. One of the earliest and most devastating memories of Josiah Henson's life was the brutal violence inflicted upon his father, an act that would permanently shape how he understood power, injustice, and survival under slavery. As a child, Josiah did not yet fully grasp the laws or economics of bondage, but he understood pain when he saw it, and fear when it entered a room and never truly left. His father was not a man given to rebellion, but in a world where even dignity could be interpreted as defiance, it took very little to provoke savage punishment. One moment of resistance, one refusal to submit fully enough, was enough to invite destruction. The incident that defined his father's fate began with an act that would have been insignificant for a free man. His father attempted to protect his wife from abuse, stepping between her and a white overseer whose authority was enforced through violence. That single act of human instinct, defending one's family, was treated as a crime worthy of extreme retribution. In the logic of slavery, an enslaved man had no right to protect, no right to intervene, no right to assert even the smallest boundary. Josiah was nearby when punishment was ordered, too young to stop it, too young to understand how such cruelty could be justified, yet old enough to remember every detail. The beating was not quick. It was public, deliberate, and meant to serve as a warning to every enslaved person who witnessed it. Josiah watched as his father was tied down and whipped mercilessly, each blow tearing flesh and dignity alive. The sound of the lash, the cries that followed, and the silence that came afterward burned themselves into his memory. This was not discipline, it was terror as spectacle. The goal was not correction but domination, to show that love, courage, and protection had no place in a system built on fear. When the beating ended, Josiah's father was barely alive. Blood soaked the ground, and the man who had once lifted him, taught him, and given him a sense of safety now lay broken, unable to stand without help. Josiah's mother could do nothing but watch, knowing that any protest would bring the same fate upon herself or her children. The helplessness of that moment became a lesson Josiah carried with him for the rest of his life. Slavery thrived, not only on physical violence, but on the forced witnessing of it. The punishment did not end with the beat. As if broken bones and torn skin were not enough, Josiah's father was later sold away as an additional act of punishment. Separation was used as a weapon, calculated to destroy families and erase any lingering sense of resistance. For Josiah, this was the moment his family truly shattered. His father did not return. There was no farewell, no explanation offered to the children, no acknowledgement that a life had been permanently altered. One day his father existed, and the next day he was gone, reduced to an entry in a ledger, his humanity erased by a transaction. The psychological impact of this violence was profound. Josiah learned early that strength could provoke cruelty, that love could invite punishment, and that the people he depended on most could be taken without warning. This knowledge did not make him reckless or rebellious as a child. It made him watchful. He began to study the behavior of slaveholders and overseers, learning their moods, their patterns, and their thresholds. Survival depended on anticipation. Understanding when danger was approaching could mean the difference between pain and momentary safety. The memory of his father's suffering also reshaped how Josiah understood masculinity and courage. In a society that equated manhood with dominance, his father's courage lay in protection, not power. Though punished for it, that act of defense became a quiet model for Josiah, teaching him that true strength did not come from cruelty, but from standing for what was right, even when the cost was unbearable. This lesson stayed with him, influencing the way he later led, guided and protected others whenever he found himself in positions of responsibility. Violence against enslaved fathers carried a particular cruelty because it attacked the foundation of family life. Children were meant to see their fathers as powerless, stripped of authority and dignity, unable to shield them from harm. For Josiah, witnessing this violence was both devastating and formative. It forced him to confront the reality that the system was designed not only to exploit labor but to destroy lineage, continuity and memory. Slavery did not merely enslave individuals, it sought to sever generations. After his father was taken away, the plantation felt different. The absence was physical and emotional, a silence that followed Josiah everywhere. Tasks continued as before, commands were issued as usual, but something essential had been removed. His mother carried her grief quietly, knowing that open mourning could be punished. Josiah learned from her restraint, understanding that sorrow had to be hidden, stored away, and endured privately. This emotional discipline became another survival skill, one learned not by choice but by necessity. The scars left on his father's body before he was sold became symbols in Josiah's mind, reminders of what awaited anyone who challenged the system too openly. Yet they also became markers of truth, proof that slavery's violence was not accidental or rare, but foundational. Every law, every custom, every unspoken rule was enforced ultimately through the threat of such brutality. Josiah's childhood innocence was stripped away by this realization, replaced by an early understanding of injustice that would later fuel his determination to escape and speak out. As Josiah grew older, the memory of his father's beating never faded. It resurfaced in moments of fear, in moments of anger, and in moments when he witnessed others being punished. Each time it reinforced the reality that slavery relied on breaking bodies to control minds. Yet paradoxically, it also planted within him a deep resolve. If such suffering was required to maintain the system, then the system itself was fundamentally wrong. This defining act of violence did more than traumatize Josiah. It shaped his moral framework. He learned that obedience did not guarantee safety, that innocence offered no protection, and that cruelty was often arbitrary. These lessons would later inform his decisions, his leadership and his willingness to risk everything for freedom, rooted in a childhood memory of a father beaten for doing what any human being would instinctively do. Growing up under brutal masters meant that every stage of Josiah Henson's childhood and early youth was governed by fear, control and constant uncertainty. The men who claimed ownership over his body believed absolute authority was their right, and they exercised it without restraint. For Josiah, there was no single master whose cruelty stood apart. Rather, cruelty was woven into daily life, expressed through commands, punishments, and the ever-present threat of violence. Masters controlled not only where he worked and slept, but how he spoke, how he stood, when he ate, and whether he was allowed to exist without pain for even a moment. The brutality was not always loud or dramatic. Often it came quietly, in rules enforced without explanation, and punishments delivered without warning. Josiah learned early that questioning orders, even politely, could be interpreted as defiant. A glance held too long, a posture deemed disrespectful, or a task completed imperfectly could all provoke punishment. This unpredictability was itself a weapon. Masters maintained control by ensuring that enslaved people never felt safe, never felt certain that obedience alone would spare them. Physical violence was a constant presence. Whippings were administered publicly to reinforce fear, but private beatings were just as common, carried out away from witnesses where no record would remain except on the body itself. Josiah saw backs scarred beyond recognition, heard cries stifled by the knowledge that screaming often made punishment worse, and learned to read pain in the way people moved long after wounds had healed. His own body became familiar with exhaustion, hunger and the sting of discipline delivered not to teach, but to dominate. Masters also controlled time, a subtle yet devastating form of cruelty. Enslaved people did not own their mornings or nights. Work began before sunrise and often continued until darkness made labor impossible. Rest was not a right, but a temporary condition, granted only when work could no longer be extracted. For Josiah, childhood passed not in play or learning but in labor measured by seasons and survival. The passing of years was marked by strength gained through toil and innocence lost through exposure to suffering. Emotional control was just as strict as physical control. Masters discouraged any display of joy,
grief or anger that suggested an inner life beyond servitude. Laughter could be seen as mockery, sorrow as weakness, and silence as plotting. Josiah learned to regulate his expressions carefully, masking his thoughts behind a practiced calm. This emotional restraint was not natural, it was learned under pressure, shaped by repeated reminders that emotions could be punished just as harshly as actions. Family life under brutal masters was constantly under threat. Josiah never knew how long those he loved would remain near. Masters reserved the right to sell, trade, or give away enslaved people at any moment, often as punishment or financial convenience. Each day carried the unspoken fear of separation, bonds formed carefully, always shadowed by the possibility of loss. Josiah watched families broken apart without ceremony, children removed from parents' arms, spouses divided with no expectation of reunion. Masters used favoritism as another method of control, granting small privileges to some while denying them to others, fostering competition rather than unity. Josiah observed how this strategy weakened collective resistance, encouraging enslaved people to seek individual survival rather than shared defiance. Even kindness from a master was dangerous because it could be withdrawn instantly and used to demand greater obedience in return. Josiah learned not to trust moments of mercy, understanding that they were part of the same system of manipulation. Education was strictly forbidden, and ignorance was enforced as policy. Masters understood that knowledge threatened their authority, so reading and writing were denied with brutal efficiency. Josiah's curiosity had to be hidden. He listened carefully to conversations, memorized words he overheard, and pieced together understanding from fragments. Learning became an act of quiet resistance, carried out in secrecy and risk. The very act of thinking freely was a rebellion under such control. Religious instruction, when permitted, was twisted to reinforce submission. Masters emphasized obedience, patience, and suffering as virtues while ignoring teachings of justice or liberation. Josiah learned to distinguish between the faith used to comfort the enslaved and the faith used to control. He absorbed spiritual language but questioned its application, recognizing that masters often invoked God to justify cruelty rather than to challenge it. The psychological toll of growing up under such conditions was immense. Constant surveillance eroded trust, not only in masters but sometimes even among the enslaved themselves. Informants were rewarded, rumors spread quickly, and secrecy became essential. Josiah learned to guard his words carefully, understanding that a careless sentence could bring punishment not only upon himself, but upon others. This awareness sharpened his mind, training him to think before speaking, to observe before acting. Despite the brutality, Josiah noticed moments of humanity that masters could not fully erase. Enslaved people shared food when rations were scarce, sang quietly to one another after exhausting days, and passed down stories that preserved identity and memory. These acts of resistance, small but powerful, taught Josiah that control was never complete. Even under the harshest masters, something remained beyond their reach. Masters attempted to define Josiah entirely by labor value, measuring his worth by strength and productivity. As he grew older and stronger, expectations increased, and mistakes were punished more harshly. He was no longer a child whose errors could be dismissed. He was an asset to be exploited fully. This shift marked another loss of protection, reinforcing the reality that under slavery, age brought not authority but greater vulnerability. Josiah's survival under brutal masters depended on adaptability. He learned to adjust his behavior to different temperaments, recognizing which masters demanded silence, which demanded enthusiasm, and which demanded submission so absolute it erased individuality. This constant adjustment required emotional labor that drained him, yet it also sharpened his awareness and resilience. Living under total control forced Josiah to develop an inner world that masters could not access. His thoughts, memories, and moral compass became private territory. Though his body was owned, his sense of right and wrong continued to grow, shaped by suffering and observation. He learned that brutality was not natural or necessary, but chosen, maintained by people who benefited from it. These years under brutal masters did not break Josiah Henson, but they shaped him profoundly, teaching him the mechanics of oppression from the inside, imprinting lessons that would later guide his leadership, his resistance, and his understanding of freedom as something far deeper than the absence of change.
Despite living in a world designed to keep him ignorant and obedient, Josiah Henson developed a deep hunger for knowledge and an instinct for leadership that slavery could neither permit nor fully suppress. The laws of the South made it illegal for enslaved people to learn to read or write, not because literacy was rare but because it was powerful. Slaveholders understood that education opened the door to questioning authority, interpreting laws, reading maps, and imagining life beyond bondage. For Josiah, this denial only sharpened his awareness that knowledge was something worth risking everything for. From an early age, he paid close attention to language. He listened carefully when white men spoke among themselves, memorizing words, phrases, and meanings. He watched how documents were handled, how contracts were discussed, how instructions were given and enforced. Even without access to books, Josiah learned by observation, turning every conversation into a lesson. His mind became a quiet classroom, absorbing information in fragments and assembling them into understanding. Literacy did not come to him openly or easily. Every attempt to learn carried danger. Discovery could result in severe punishment, including whipping or sale. Yet Josiah persisted, finding small opportunities wherever they appeared. Sometimes a sympathetic individual would offer guidance in secret. Other times he taught himself by recognizing letters on signs, labels, or scraps of paper discarded by others. Each word learned was an act of resistance, a step toward reclaiming a part of himself that slavery insisted he did not deserve. As his understanding grew, so did his sense of responsibility toward others. Leadership among the enslaved was not granted. It emerged naturally from trust, intelligence, and moral strength. Josiah showed an unusual ability to organize, to calm tensions, and to guide others through difficult situations. He understood that survival often depended on cooperation, and he worked quietly to encourage unity rather than conflict. His leadership was not loud or confrontational. It was steady, thoughtful, and rooted in concern for the collective. Masters noticed his competence long before they understood its source. Josiah was often placed in positions of responsibility, trusted to manage tasks, supervise work, and communicate instructions to others. This trust was born of convenience, not respect, but it gave him valuable insight into the workings of the plantation system. He learned how decisions were made, how resources were allocated, and how authority functioned. These experiences sharpened his leadership skills, even as they forced him to walk a dangerous line between obedience and self-preservation. Leading others while enslaved required constant caution. Josiah had to appear loyal to his masters while earning the confidence of those he led. Any perception that he encouraged resistance could bring swift punishment. He learned how to speak in ways that carried meaning without drawing attention, how to give advice that sounded like obedience, and how to protect others without openly challenging authority. This subtle leadership demanded emotional intelligence and restraint far beyond his years. Education for Josiah extended beyond reading and writing. He studied people. He observed how fear influenced behavior, how hope sustained endurance, and how despair could spread if left unaddressed. He learned how to motivate without force, how to listen more than he spoke, and how to lead by example. These skills were forged in necessity, shaped by the understanding that mistakes could cost lives. Faith also played a role in his development. Biblical stories, often shared orally among the enslaved, became sources of inspiration and instruction. Josiah listened to tales of deliverance, justice, and perseverance, interpreting them through the lens of his own experience. While masters used religion to preach submission, Josiah found in it lessons of leadership, responsibility, and moral courage. He began to see himself not just as a survivor, but as someone with a purpose beyond endurance. As his literacy improved, Josiah became increasingly aware of the contradictions of slavery. He recognized the hypocrisy of a nation that spoke of freedom while denying it to millions. Words he learned took on new meanings when applied to his own life. Concepts like justice, law, and humanity were no longer abstract. They were personal, urgent, and painfully absent. This awareness deepened his resolve, even as it forced him to hide his thoughts carefully. Teaching himself under such conditions required patience and discipline. Progress was slow, uneven, and often interrupted. There were long periods when learning had to stop entirely due to fear or increased supervision, yet Josiah never abandoned it. Each setback reinforced his belief that education was not merely a skill, but a form of freedom that could exist even when physical freedom was denied. His leadership became more visible as others began to rely on him for guidance. People sought his advice, trusted his judgment, and followed his example. He did not claim authority. It was given to him through consistent action and integrity. This trust carried heavy responsibility. Josiah understood that his choices affected not only himself but those who depended on him. Leadership under slavery meant bearing risk on behalf of others. Masters continued to underestimate the significance of his intellect, seeing him only as a capable worker rather than a thinking man. This underestimation became one of his greatest protections. It allowed him to grow quietly, to prepare without suspicion, and to strengthen his mind while appearing compliant. The very system that sought to limit him provided the cover under which he developed. The laws meant to keep him ignorant failed to account for determination. Josiah proved that education was not confined to classrooms or books, but lived in attention, memory, and courage. His self-taught literacy opened pathways that would later allow him to navigate escape, communicate effectively, and advocate for others. His leadership, formed under oppression, carried the weight of experience rather than theory. These abilities did not separate him from others, they tied him more deeply to their struggles. Josiah understood that knowledge gained only for oneself was incomplete. Leadership meant service, sacrifice, and often silence. He continued to learn not for recognition but for readiness, aware that a moment would come when everything he had taught himself would be tested under circumstances far more dangerous than secrecy and fear. As Josiah Henson matured, his intelligence, reliability, and quiet authority drew the attention of his enslavers, who began to place increasing trust in him, eventually elevating him to the role of overseer over other enslaved people. This position was not a reward in any meaningful sense, but a calculated decision by masters who valued efficiency and control. By placing an enslaved man in charge of others, they reduced their own labor while deepening divisions among the enslaved. For Josiah, the role came with painful contradictions. He was expected to enforce the very system that oppressed him, to discipline people who shared his suffering, while remaining outwardly loyal to those who claimed ownership over his life. Becoming a trusted overseer required Josiah to walk a narrow and dangerous path. Masters expected obedience, productivity, and absolute alignment with their interests. Any sign of sympathy toward the enslaved people under his supervision could be interpreted as weakness or rebellion. At the same time, those he oversaw watched him closely, uncertain whether he would become an instrument of cruelty or a shield against it. Trust was fragile on both sides, and a single misstep could cost him his position, his safety, or his life. Josiah approached this role with deep moral conflict. He understood the harm that overseers often inflicted, having witnessed it throughout his childhood. Many overseers used violence to assert authority, driven by fear or resentment. Josiah refused to lead through brutality. Instead, he relied on communication, example, and quiet intervention. He worked alongside others whenever possible, sharing the burden rather than standing apart from it. This approach was risky, but it allowed him to maintain a measure of dignity and earn the respect of those around him. His masters, focused on output rather than methods, largely overlooked the subtleties of his leadership. As long as work was completed and order maintained, they did not question how Josiah achieved it. This oversight gave him a narrow space in which to operate, and he used it carefully. He learned how to diffuse conflict before it escalated, how to protect vulnerable individuals from harsher punishment, and how to negotiate outcomes that minimized suffering without drawing attention. Serving as overseer also gave Josiah access to information denied to most enslaved people. He heard plans discussed, routes mentioned, financial pressures revealed. He learned how slaveholders thought, how they calculated risk, and what they feared losing. This knowledge became invaluable. He listened more than he spoke, storing details away, understanding that information could one day mean the difference between capture and freedom. Despite appearing loyal, Josiah never stopped thinking about escape. His role required him to move between spaces, to travel short distances, and to interact with people beyond the immediate plantation. Each movement expanded his understanding of geography and opportunity. He noted roads, waterways, and borders, mentally mapping a world that he might one day navigate alone. Planning freedom was not a single decision but a gradual process, built from observation, patience, and restraint. Internally, the strain of his position was heavy. Being trusted by masters meant carrying their expectations, while being watched by the enslaved meant carrying their hopes. Josiah lived with constant fear that his intentions would be misunderstood by one side or discovered by the other. He knew that many overseers were hated for their cruelty, and he worked tirelessly to avoid becoming one of them. His conscience demanded that he protect others, even when doing so increased his own risk. At night, when labor ended and watchfulness eased slightly, Josiah reflected on the fragile balance he maintained. He understood that his apparent status offered no real security. At any moment a master could withdraw trust, accuse him falsely, or sell him away. Loyalty did not guarantee protection. This knowledge fueled his determination to prepare for the day when he would no longer depend on the whims of others for survival. Josiah also recognized that escape would not be possible without careful timing. His responsibilities made sudden flight impossible. Others depended on him, and any rash move could bring punishment upon them. He began to consider how freedom could be pursued without causing harm, weighing his desire to leave against his sense of duty. This internal struggle shaped his planning, forcing him to think not only about his own safety but about the consequences for those left behind. The role of overseer sharpened his leadership in ways that no other position could have. He learned how to manage people under pressure, how to make decisions with limited options,
and how to maintain moral clarity in morally compromised circumstances. These skills, developed under coercion, would later become essential when he guided others to freedom and helped build communities beyond slavery. Masters mistook his effectiveness for contentment. They believed that trust and responsibility had bound him more tightly to the system. In reality, these things only revealed its weaknesses. Josiah saw firsthand how dependent slaveholders were on the competence of those they enslaved. The system relied on people it claimed were inferior, and that contradiction became increasingly clear to him. As he continued to serve outwardly, Josiah refined his inner plan. He conserved energy, avoided unnecessary conflict, and waited. Freedom required patience as much as courage. Every day as an overseer added to his understanding, strengthened his resolve, and confirmed that loyalty under slavery was a one-sided contract, honored only when convenient to those in power. After years of service marked by obedience, sacrifice and unwavering loyalty, Josiah Henson came to a devastating realization that would permanently alter his understanding of slavery and trust. He had given his strength, intelligence, and conscience to his master, believing carefully and cautiously that faithful service might one day lead to freedom. This belief was not born of naivety but of repeated assurances, spoken promises that dangled hope just close enough to sustain endurance. In a system built on lies, even the smallest promise could become a lifeline, and Josiah clung to it with measured faith. His master had repeatedly assured him that if he continued to serve well, freedom would be granted. These assurances were not casual remarks, they were specific, deliberate, and repeated over time. Josiah was told that his loyalty was seen, that his reliability mattered, and that emancipation was not only possible but planned. Such promises carried enormous weight for an enslaved man who had no legal standing to demand anything. Trust in this context was an act of survival. Motivated by these promises, Josiah worked harder, took on greater responsibility, and endured personal sacrifice without complaint. He protected property that was not his own, enforced discipline he despised, and shielded his master's interests even when it brought him resentment from others. He believed that honor, consistency, and moral conduct might eventually be rewarded. Each task completed, each crisis managed, became another step toward the freedom he had been led to experience. When the opportunity arose to purchase his freedom through a negotiated agreement, Josiah seized it, believing it was the fulfillment of what he had been promised. He traveled long distances on his master's behalf, handling money, conducting business, and carrying out transactions with remarkable integrity. The very fact that he was entrusted with such responsibilities reinforced his belief that his master's word would be honored. Few enslaved men were given such latitude, and Josiah understood both the privilege and the risk involved. The betrayal came not suddenly but with crushing clarity. After Josiah completed his obligations and returned, expecting the promise to be fulfilled, he learned that his master had no intention of honoring the agreement. The conditions were changed, the assurances withdrawn, and the freedom he had worked toward was quietly denied. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the sacrifice made, only a cold assertion of ownership, as if the promises had never existed. This betrayal struck deeper than physical punishment ever had. Josiah had endured violence, deprivation, and humiliation, but this was different. It was a calculated erasure of trust, a reminder that under slavery, even the most faithful service carried no guarantee of humanity. The system allowed masters to lie without consequence, to manipulate hope as easily as they wielded the. Josiah realized that loyalty under slavery was not a virtue rewarded, but a tool exploited. The emotional weight of this moment was immense. Years of restraint, patience, and internal negotiation collapsed into a single truth: his future would never be secure as long as it depended on another man's word. The betrayal forced him to confront the reality that no level of obedience could overcome a system designed to deny freedom. It stripped away the final illusion that slavery could be navigated honorably toward liberation. Josiah did not respond with open anger or confrontation. He understood the danger of expressing outrage in a world where his life could be ended or sold away in an instant. Instead, his response was internal and decisive. Something hardened within him, not bitterness, but clarity. The hope he had placed in his master was withdrawn, and replaced with resolve. From that moment forward, freedom would not be requested or earned through loyalty. It would be taken through action. The betrayal also reshaped how Josiah viewed the structure of slavery itself. He saw that the system depended not only on violence but on deception. Promises were used to extract more labor, more obedience, more sacrifice, while ensuring that true power remained untouched. This understanding deepened his determination to escape, not just for himself, but to expose the moral emptiness of the institution. He reflected on the years he had spent protecting interests that were never aligned with his own, and on the people he had tried to shield while believing that patience would eventually bring justice. The realization was painful, but it sharpened his awareness. He understood now that survival required strategy, not trust, and that freedom demanded risk rather than reward. The betrayal also carried a warning: if his master could deceive him so completely, then no enslaved person was safe relying on promise. This knowledge would later shape how Josiah spoke to others, how he advised them, and how he prepared them for the realities of escape and resistance. Hope, he learned, had to be grounded in action, not assurance. From that moment, Josiah began to plan with urgency rather than patience. The careful waiting that had once defined his approach was replaced by quiet preparation. He observed more closely, conserved his strength, and weighed his options with renewed seriousness. The path ahead was dangerous, but remaining where he was now felt far more perilous. The betrayal did not break Josiah Henson, but it severed the last tie binding him emotionally to the system that enslaved him. Trust was replaced by understanding, obedience by intention, and hope by resolve, marking a turning point where freedom ceased to be a promise and became a necessity.
The decision to escape slavery was not a sudden act of desperation for Josiah Henson, but the result of years of observation, restraint, and inner preparation sharpened by betrayal. Once the final illusion of trust was stripped away, every movement, conversation, and responsibility took on new meaning. Freedom was no longer a distant possibility. It was an urgent necessity. Yet escaping slavery was not merely a matter of running. It required precision, timing, and the willingness to risk everything, not just for himself but for those bound to him by family and responsibility. Josiah understood that escape meant crossing not only physical distance but invisible boundaries enforced by law, violence, and human pursuit. Slave catchers, patrols, informants, and harsh penalties stood between him and freedom. The landscape itself was hostile, filled with roads designed for commerce, not refuge. Any misstep could lead to capture, brutal punishment, or death. Knowledge became his greatest weapon. He relied on the mental maps he had formed over years of travel and responsibility, recalling rivers, paths, settlements, and borders learned quietly while appearing loyal. The Underground Railroad was not a single route or organization but a fragile network of courage, secrecy, and trust. Josiah had heard whispers of it long before he relied on it, fragments of stories passed among the enslaved, often cautiously, always with fear. These stories spoke of people who helped without reward, of safe houses hidden in plain sight, of signals understood only by those who needed them. Each detail was uncertain, but together they formed a possibility that grew stronger as remaining enslaved became unbearable. When the moment came, Josiah did not flee alone. He chose to escape with his family, a decision that multiplied both danger and purpose. Escaping with others meant moving more slowly, avoiding detection for longer periods, and managing fear under extreme pressure. Children could cry, exhaustion could force rest at the worst times, and hunger could weaken resolve. Yet leaving them behind was unthinkable. Freedom without family felt incomplete, and Josiah accepted the increased risk without hesitation. The journey began under the cover of secrecy, each step taken with careful attention to sound, light, and movement. Traveling by night reduced visibility but increased danger, as unfamiliar terrain could lead to injury or delay. By day they hid, relying on natural cover, abandoned structures, or the protection of those willing to risk their own safety to help. Josiah led with calm authority, suppressing his own fear to steady those who depended on him. Encounters along the way tested both faith and judgment. Not every white face meant danger, and not every black face meant safety. Josiah had learned through years of survival that trust had to be measured, earned through signs rather than words. The Underground Railroad depended on this cautious discernment. A wrong decision could undo everything. Each knock on a door, each request for help carried the weight of life or death. The people who aided them did so quietly, often at great personal risk. They provided food, shelter, directions, and reassurance, asking little in return. Some were driven by faith, others by moral conviction, all by courage. Josiah observed how these individuals defied laws they believed unjust, recognizing in them a reflection of the freedom he sought. Their assistance did not erase danger, but it made survival possible. Crossing from one safe point to another required constant adjustment. Weather changed, routes became unsafe, and rumors of patrols forced detours. Josiah adapted quickly, drawing on the leadership skills honed during his years as an overseer. He kept the group focused, managed limited resources, and made decisions under pressure. Every mile gained felt fragile, always at risk of being undone. The closer they came to the border, the greater the tension grew. Canada represented a legal boundary where slavery no longer held authority, but reaching it required crossing areas heavily watched by those eager to capture fugitives for profit. Josiah remained alert, knowing that capture at this stage would be especially brutal. Slave catchers often intensified their efforts near borders, anticipating desperation and mistakes. When they finally crossed into Canada, the change was not dramatic or announced. There was no ceremony, no immediate celebration. Freedom arrived quietly, marked by the absence of pursuit rather than the presence of safety. Josiah understood that freedom was not simply the removal of chains, but the beginning of a new struggle, one defined by uncertainty, rebuilding and responsibility. In Canada, Josiah encountered a society that, while not free from prejudice, did not legally recognize him as property. This distinction transformed every aspect of life. He could work for wages, move without permission, and speak without fear of punishment for his thought. Yet the psychological weight of slavery did not disappear overnight. Years of control and vigilance could not be shed as easily as physical chains. Freedom also brought obligation. Josiah felt a deep responsibility to help others escape, to use his experience and leadership for those still trapped in bondage. His journey through the Underground Railroad had shown him both the cruelty of slavery and the power of resistance built on cooperation. Each safe arrival strengthened his resolve to remain connected to the struggle beyond his own escape. Life in Canada required adaptation. Climate, labor, and social structures differed from what he had known. Josiah embraced these challenges with determination, viewing them as extensions of the same struggle for autonomy that had driven his escape. He worked tirelessly, not just to survive but to create stability for his family and others who followed. The Underground Railroad did more than carry Josiah Henson to freedom. It transformed him from a man seeking escape into a man committed to liberation. The journey exposed him to the full range of human cruelty and compassion, sharpening his understanding of justice and responsibility. Every step northward reinforced the truth that freedom was not given, but built through courage, sacrifice, and collective action. After securing freedom in Canada, Josiah Henson faced a new and unfamiliar challenge, transforming survival into stability, and freedom into something lasting. Escape had delivered him out of bondage, but it had not provided shelter, food, or a future. Freedom without structure could collapse into poverty and despair, especially for formerly enslaved people who arrived with nothing but trauma and determination. Josiah quickly understood that individual freedom, while vital, was incomplete unless it was supported by community dignity and economic independence. Canada offered legal protection from slavery, but it did not automatically offer acceptance or opportunity. Many formerly enslaved people encountered discrimination, isolation, and harsh living conditions. Work was often scarce, wages were low, and land ownership remained out of reach for most. Josiah observed how easily freedom could be undermined if people were forced into dependence or desperation. Drawing on his leadership experience and deep sense of responsibility, he began to envision something more ambitious than personal success, a self-sustaining settlement where formerly enslaved people could live, work, and govern themselves. The idea of building such a community was radical for its time. It challenged not only the legacy of slavery but the assumptions of a world that doubted the ability of Black people to organize, lead, and prosper independently. Josiah rejected these assumptions entirely. He believed that the same discipline, intelligence, and resilience that had allowed people to survive slavery could be redirected toward building freedom. What was needed was land, structure, and collective effort. With this vision in mind, Josiah became involved in the establishment of a Black settlement in Canada, later known as the Dawn Settlement. The goal was not merely to provide shelter but to create a functioning society rooted in education, labor, and mutual support. Families were encouraged to work together, to cultivate land, build homes, and establish institutions that reflected their values. Every structure raised, every field planted became a declaration that freedom could be productive and permanent. Josiah played a central role in organizing the settlement. His experience managing labor under extreme conditions had taught him how to coordinate people, allocate resources, and resolve conflict. Unlike slavery where labor was coerced and dehumanizing, this work was voluntary and purposeful. People labored not for the profit of a master but for the survival and growth of their own community. This shift transformed work itself, restoring dignity to effort, long associated with exploitation. Education became a cornerstone of the settlement. Josiah understood that literacy had been deliberately denied under slavery because it empowered people to think critically and claim rights. In the Dawn Settlement, schools were established to teach children and adults alike. Learning was treated not as a privilege but as a necessity. Reading,
Writing and practical skills were tools for self-defense in a world that still questioned their humanity. Religion and moral guidance also played an important role. Faith had sustained many through the horrors of slavery, and within the settlement it became a source of unity and purpose rather than submission. Josiah, deeply influenced by his spiritual beliefs, helped foster a community where faith encouraged responsibility, cooperation and justice. Religious gatherings reinforced shared values and strengthened bonds between families who had once been torn apart by force. Economic independence was essential to the settlement's survival. Josiah encouraged trades, farming and craftsmanship, ensuring that residents could support themselves without reliance on charity. This independence was crucial not only materially but psychologically. Formerly enslaved people who had been taught to see themselves as property were now landowners, workers, and decision-makers. Each act of self-sufficiency challenged the lies that slavery had imposed. The settlement also became a beacon for others still fleeing bondage. News traveled quietly but steadily, carried by word of mouth and trusted networks. For those escaping the United States, the Dawn settlement represented more than safety, it represented possibility. Josiah welcomed newcomers with the understanding that freedom was strongest when shared. He helped them adjust, find work and integrate into the community, remembering how disorienting freedom could be after a lifetime of control. Leadership within the settlement was collective rather than authoritarian. Josiah did not rule, he guided. Decisions were made with input from others, reinforcing the idea that freedom meant participation rather than obedience. This approach helped heal some of the psychological damage inflicted by slavery, where choices had been denied and voices silent. Learning to decide together was itself a form of liberation. Challenges were constant, resources were limited, winters were harsh, and external prejudice did not disappear simply because the settlement existed. There were moments of doubt, exhaustion, and disagreement. Josiah faced these difficulties with the same resilience that had carried him through bondage and escape. He understood that building freedom was harder than fleeing slavery, but also more meaningful. The settlement's success began to attract attention. Visitors, reformers and abolitionists came to see what had been built. They witnessed formerly enslaved people managing farms, educating children, and sustaining a community against odds. These visits challenged prevailing narratives about race and capability. Josiah became both a leader on the ground and a living argument against the ideology that had justified slavery. For Josiah, the settlement was not an endpoint but a foundation. It proved that freedom could be organized, defended, and expanded. It offered a model for what life after slavery could look like when people were given the chance to define themselves. Every home built and every child educated stood in direct opposition to the system that had once claimed absolute power over their lives. Through the creation of a self-sustaining black settlement, Josiah Henson transformed freedom from a personal escape into a collective achievement, demonstrating that liberation was not only about breaking chains, but about building a future strong enough to ensure they were never reattached. After establishing himself in Canada and helping build the Dawn settlement, Josiah Henson emerged not only as a leader within his community but also as a prominent figure in the international abolitionist movement. His experiences under slavery, his daring escape, and his success in creating a thriving settlement made him uniquely positioned to speak to audiences far beyond the borders of Canada. Henson understood that the story of one man could illuminate the injustices of an entire system, and he committed himself to sharing that story with the world. His journey as an abolitionist began with personal storytelling. Henson recounted his life under slavery, the beatings, the separations, the betrayals, and the narrow escapes with honesty and vividness that captured the attention of listeners. He did not romanticize suffering or dramatize heroism. He spoke plainly about the cruelty of bondage and the resilience of those who survived it. In doing so, he gave a human face to the abstract horrors that many in distant lands only understood intellectually. Henson traveled extensively, speaking to audiences composed of religious groups, reformers, educators, and politicians. These were people who had the power to influence public opinion and policy, yet many had little first-hand understanding of the realities of slavery. Henson's presence in these rooms challenged assumptions. He spoke not as a distant observer or second-hand narrator, but as someone who had lived the experience, whose body bore the marks of oppression and whose mind had been forged under its weight. His credibility was reinforced by the tangible evidence of his accomplishments. He could point to the Dawn settlement, the families thriving there, and the structures built through collective effort. These were living examples of what formerly enslaved people could achieve when given freedom, opportunity, and support. Henson's ability to combine personal testimony with practical demonstration made his message compelling in ways that abstract moral arguments often failed to achieve. Henson's speaking engagements were not without risk. Though he was in Canada, sympathetic to freedom, He remained deeply aware that he could not return to the United States without facing capture and punishment. His status as an escaped enslaved person placed him in constant potential danger, and this awareness added urgency and intensity to his words. He spoke with the conviction of someone for whom freedom had been hard-won and could be lost again if not defended and understood by others. He also recognized the strategic importance of connecting with influential allies. Abolitionist networks in the United States, the United Kingdom and Europe were already active, but they relied heavily on the testimony of those who had first-hand experience of slavery. Henson became a crucial link, providing not just stories but guidance on the realities of escape, settlement and community building. His voice helped shape advocacy, fundraising and legislative efforts aimed at undermining the institution of slavery and supporting those who had fled. Henson's international engagement was grounded in both moral clarity and practical instruction. He spoke about the necessity of education, self-sufficiency and faith, emphasizing that liberation was more than leaving bondage, it was building lives of dignity and purpose. He described how communities could organize, how labor could be productive and empowering, and how families could be restored and strengthened. His talks were not simply condemnations of slavery, they were blueprints for what freedom could achieve when paired with planning, discipline and collective effort. As his reputation grew, Henson became a sought-after figure for journalists, writers and reformers who wanted to document the truth of slavery. His life inspired biographies and articles, and through these publications his story reached audiences who might never attend a lecture. Henson understood the power of the written word to complement oral testimony, ensuring that the lessons of his life could endure and influence beyond immediate encounters. Despite public recognition, Henson remained deeply humble about his role. He consistently framed his achievements as collective rather than personal, emphasizing the work of families, neighbors and other settlers who had contributed to the Dawn settlement. He wanted audiences to understand that freedom was not the accomplishment of a single individual but the product of community, cooperation and shared courage. This perspective reinforced the moral imperative behind abolitionist work, that every person liberated from bondage contributed to a larger vision of justice. His interactions with world leaders and reformers also shaped his understanding of strategy. Henson realized that moral appeals alone were insufficient. Structural change required both persuasion and evidence. By sharing practical models of liberated communities and effective leadership, he provided proof that formerly enslaved people could thrive, directly countering arguments that slavery was necessary or justified. His life became a living testament to capability, resilience and moral strength. Henson's international engagement did not distance him from the plight of those still in bondage. He maintained active connections with the Underground Railroad and other networks supporting escape. He offered guidance on settlement, education and survival, understanding that his story could inspire hope while his practical knowledge could save lives. His influence extended beyond rhetoric. It had tangible effects on the movement to dismantle slavery and support freedom. Through these efforts, Henson became more than a survivor or escapee. He became a symbol. His story was adapted and referenced in literature, speeches and reform campaigns, illustrating both the horrors of slavery and the possibilities of liberation. Yet Henson himself never sought fame. He sought change. His personal narrative served a purpose larger than himself, a tool to awaken conscience, mobilize action and demonstrate the humanity of those whom society had attempted to dehumanize. Henson's work as an abolitionist also shaped the moral imagination of those he reached. Listeners who had never witnessed slavery firsthand were confronted with its realities in ways that statistics or distant reports could not convey. His descriptions of family separations, betrayal and resilience made abstract injustice tangible. Audiences could see, feel and understand the stakes, which fueled support for abolitionist policies and humanitarian assistance for freed and fugitive individuals. Even as he traveled and spoke, Henson remained mindful of the long-term challenges faced by formerly enslaved people. Freedom was not merely the absence of chains, it was the presence of opportunity, safety and community. He emphasized that liberation required continuous effort, building homes, educating children, establishing sustainable economies and fostering moral leadership. His message combined urgency with pragmatism, inspiring hope while demanding preparation, discipline and force. Through decades of speaking, traveling and teaching, Josiah Henson transformed his personal experiences into a force for collective liberation. His life, from enslavement to escape to settlement building and international advocacy, exemplified the resilience, intelligence and moral clarity necessary to challenge an oppressive system. He became a bridge between worlds, connecting those in bondage to those with the power to intervene, and demonstrating that freedom, while hard-won, could be sustained and multiplied.
Josiah Henson's legacy extended far beyond his own lifetime, not only shaping the lives of those he directly assisted but also influencing culture, literature, and the collective memory of slavery in ways that few contemporaries could have anticipated. His experiences, leadership, and advocacy formed the foundation for a broader understanding of what it meant to survive, resist, and thrive after bondage. While his story was deeply personal, it resonated universally, illustrating the human capacity for resilience, moral courage, and transformative action in the face of systemic oppression. Henson's life became the basis for much of the cultural imagining of slavery and freedom, most famously influencing Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Though Stowe's novel took creative liberties, her depiction of Uncle Tom drew heavily on Henson's character, morality, and steadfastness. Through literature, Henson's story reached millions, shaping perceptions of slavery in the United States and abroad. Readers encountered the humanity, suffering, and dignity of enslaved people through a lens grounded in Henson's lived experience, giving moral weight to the abolitionist cause and inspiring empathy among audiences who might otherwise have remained indifferent. The connection between Henson and Stowe's work, while indirect, highlights the broader impact of personal testimony in affecting social change. Henson's autobiography, The Life of Josiah Henson, formerly a slave, now an inhabitant of Canada, provided the factual backbone for cultural representations and offered readers first-hand insight into slavery's realities. It detailed not only his hardships but also his strategies for survival, his leadership qualities, and his commitment to community. The book served as a blueprint for understanding resilience under oppression, showing that escape and freedom were not singular events but ongoing processes requiring intellect, courage, and moral guidance. Beyond literature, Henson's story had educational significance. Schools, lecture halls, and reform societies used his life as an example of endurance, intelligence, and ethical leadership. Teachers highlighted his emphasis on literacy, community building, and moral responsibility as instructive for young audiences, demonstrating how education and self-determination could empower those previously denied rights. His narrative became both cautionary and aspirational, showing the depths of human cruelty while celebrating the triumphs of human spirit and agency. Henson's influence was also deeply practical. The Dawn settlement he helped establish remained a model for subsequent communities of freed and fugitive Black people, illustrating how social organization, cooperative labor, and shared governance could create self-sustaining and thriving environments. Other settlements looked to Dawn as evidence that autonomy and success were possible outside the structures of slavery. Henson's leadership provided a template for building institutions grounded in dignity, education, and economic stability, demonstrating that freedom required not only physical escape but also deliberate and disciplined construction of life and society. His ongoing advocacy emphasized the moral responsibility of those who had escaped slavery to assist others still in bondage. Henson understood that individual liberation was insufficient if the system persisted. By mentoring escapees, providing guidance, and offering support, he contributed to the broader abolitionist network and strengthened the capacity of communities in transition. His approach combined empathy with strategy, recognizing that effective leadership required balancing care for others with prudence, discretion, and foresight. Henson's story also challenged prevailing assumptions about race, capability, and human potential. By demonstrating intelligence, moral fortitude, and practical skill, he refuted arguments used to justify slavery and discrimination. His life became a counter-narrative to pervasive stereotypes, showing that leadership, ingenuity, and ethical strength were not bound by skin color but nurtured through opportunity and necessity. The visibility of his achievements reshaped perceptions in ways that pure political rhetoric often could not. Moreover, Henson's legacy influenced subsequent generations of civil rights and human rights activists. His insistence on education, community, and moral responsibility offered principles that were adopted and adapted by later movements seeking justice and equality. His life demonstrated the importance of combining personal agency with collective action, showing that meaningful change required both individual courage and organized effort. Leaders could draw inspiration from his balance of pragmatism and ethical conviction, applying lessons learned from his experience to new struggles in evolving contexts. Even in Canada, where he spent his later years, Henson became a figure of respect and influence. Communities he helped shape continued to thrive, and his guidance helped ensure the continuity of values he had championed throughout his life: self-reliance, education, mutual aid, and moral integrity. Residents looked to him not only as a founder but as a mentor, a living example of resilience and strategic thinking. His presence reinforced the principle that freedom was a responsibility as well as a right, requiring constant effort and dedication to sustain. The broader cultural and historical recognition of Henson's life also underscores the importance of storytelling in shaping collective memory. Personal narratives like his provide texture, nuance, and emotional resonance that statistics and legal documents can. By articulating the realities of slavery and the challenges of freedom, Henson ensured that future generations would encounter the complexity of human experience under oppression, gaining insight into both the moral failures of societies and the capacities of individuals to resist and rebuild. Henson's influence extended to policy discussions and social reform efforts as well. Abolitionists, legislators, and international observers used his testimony to argue for change, illustrating that the perspectives of formerly enslaved individuals were essential for crafting just and informed solutions. Henson's lived experience gave credibility and urgency to these debates, demonstrating that reform required listening to those most affected by injustice and recognizing their expertise as legitimate and essential. Ultimately, Josiah Henson's life exemplifies the multidimensional impact of survival, leadership, and moral courage. His escape from slavery was the first step in a lifelong journey of service, advocacy, and example. Through autobiography, public speaking, community building, and mentorship, he shaped cultural understanding, inspired reform, and created institutions that embodied the principles of freedom, dignity, and human potential. His story reminds the world that liberation is never only a personal achievement, it is a responsibility to others, a testament to resilience, and a foundation for ongoing justice. Josiah Henson's life stands as a testament to the extraordinary power of courage, resilience, and moral conviction. From the brutal realities of enslavement to the triumph of freedom, his journey reveals that true liberation is not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of dignity, education, and community. He transformed suffering into leadership, betrayal into resolve, and escape into a foundation for countless others to claim freedom. His legacy endures not only in the settlements he built or the stories he inspired, but in the enduring lesson that the human spirit, when guided by courage and conscience, can overcome even the most oppressive system. Josiah Henson's story reminds us that one life, lived with integrity and purpose, can illuminate the path to justice for generations, turning pain into progress, and oppression into a beacon of hope that continues to inspire the world.